Hello and welcome to this segment on historical causation. Historical causation being one of the foundational historical learning skills that we really want students to know and understand. What was the cause and effect of certain events? Now with historical causation, a lot of times teachers are hungry for ideas as to how they can really get students to think about historical causation and how to get them to engage with chronology as they look at that. 6 degrees of separation is one of those strategies that students can use for not only historical inquiry, but that teachers can use in so many different ways within their classroom. So when we look at historical causation in a little bit more depth, really what we're going to be talking about is, with 6 degrees of separation, how can we have students look at chronology, continuity and change over time, and looking at how one event impacts the next. My name is Heidi Link. I'm a social studies teacher from Forest Lake area schools and currently serving in the role as a peer coach for our district. In this role, I've been exposed to so many wonderful teaching strategies and trainings, and 6 degrees of separation is one of those that has not only stuck with me and transformed my practice as an educator, but in educators that I've shared it with and have worked with, and other AP educators for AP US History have certainly found it beneficial as well. So I hope it will be beneficial for you in your classroom too. So when we're looking at historical causation, really the basic that it comes down to is knowing that nothing ever comes to be without a cause, right? As Plato once said, everything happens and there's a cause or there's a root for what caused that end result. And so when we begin to dive into historical causation, it's really about having our students trace it back to whatever the root cause was. And I love the question, how did this come to be, right? And so when we ask that question, how did this come to be, then we're able to not only identify the root cause, but we're also then able to have our students analyze deeper for, is there common lineage or common ties to that root cause in other areas where we can then find other pieces like continuity and change over time and those other historical thinking skills too that we can tie in. So for historical causation, like I said, my absolute favorite in-class activity came from Thomas Sleet's AP US History session, and he is fabulous. His information is in here as well a little bit later, but 6 degrees of separation. And this is an activity that you can do totally on a whim in class where you need absolutely no preparation, or you can put extensive preparation into it and have pre-made handouts and those sorts of things that are right there and ready to go for you too. So when we start to look at 6 degrees of separation, really as a teacher, you have 2 things that you need to decide. You need to decide a starting event and an ending event. And making sure that somehow, of course, those 2 events are connected with whatever the inquiry is that you're wanting your students to investigate. The students then will be challenged to identify 4 events that connect together that beginning and end event. 6 degrees of separation, right? 6 events in the end. They'll have to not only identify those events, but they'll have to connect them all together, justify the connections, and then of course you can enrich and deepen it as much as you want to go. You can have the students collect and share and discuss the information in partners or in full class, and then really having them explain that historical causation to the class, and then you can recap or highlight some of those pieces. And after you're done with looking at the historical causation piece, then broadening it and asking them for connections to whatever courses they had had prior, or units or chapters you had studied prior, for what is that continuity and change over time. And so with this activity, you will find it so versatile and user-friendly, and the students find it highly engaging as well. So today I'll talk to you not only about how to use it, but I'm going to provide you with an example, both a broad example of how 6 degrees of separation could be used as almost, a semester wrap-up or course wrap-up, or at the beginning of a course to tie together world history and U.S. history. But then also I'll give you a more narrow focus example too, and some extension activities for how 6 degrees of separation might be used within your own classroom. So for our first example of 6 degrees of separation, I have the Crusades as our starting event, and then 9/11 as our end event. Now what I would encourage you to do is to pause your computer and take the time to actually fill this out yourself so that you could see what it's like as a student engaging in this activity. So if I were to ask you, how would you connect together the Crusades to 9/11? What 4 major events do you think were most important in having or in connecting those 2 events? Which 4 events would you choose? And make sure that you put them in chronological order, right? Connecting them and putting them in place. Now, after identifying those 4 pieces, the next thing that we ask in each of those areas is the students to dive a little deeper than just identifying the event itself. So what I ask my students to do in each of the boxes then is describe or provide me with a summary of the event. I want them to connect it not only to the Crusades and 9/11 or to my start and end event, but I also challenge them to connect it to the surrounding events to really make sure that they're being intentional with all 4 of the events that they're picking. And then the very last question is one that truthfully is probably most important to me, is what is the historical significance of the events that the students have selected? Right? Why does it matter so what in society today? And so if I asked you and if you identified those 4 events connecting the Crusades to 9/11, what would they be? How would you summarize each of those events? How do they connect to the Crusades and to 9/11? How do they connect to the events that surround them? And what is the historical significance of each and every one of those events? Right? After students have gone through and they've identified those 4, you can either have them turn it in or whatever you want from there, or you can really have them engage in the discussion. Now, the basic discussion questions for 6 degrees of separation are these 3. How are the start and end events similar, right? What is that continuity for the events that you're looking at? And how are the events different? What has changed between the Crusades and 9/11? And then really making students justify their thinking. Why those 4 that they picked, right? Why those 4? Why not any of the hundreds and millions of others that they potentially could have picked connecting those 2 events together? And if you just partner them with one other person in class, never once in all of the years that I have been doing this activity have students all had, or any 2 students had, the exact same events picked for their 6 degrees of separation. So there's always room for conversation. So if you have them get together with their elbow buddy or their crosstown partner or whatever it may be, right, and engage in that conversation, why those 4? Why are your 4 more important than the 4 of your partner that you're sitting with? And then if you really want to deepen the discussion and have them really, really delve into it, right, then you start to challenge them more. What event could you replace the Crusades with and still keep every other one of your events in your chronology the same? Or you could flip it, right, and change the end one. What event could you replace 9/11 with and still maintain the Crusades and all of the other 4 events within your timeline? And how do every single one of those events continue to impact our society today? Now I know probably in your head right now you're having like racing thoughts and everything going as to how much time this could take up within your class. And truthfully, it can take up as much time as you want for it to, which is why the activity is so powerful, because this activity easily can take up an entire class period if you're willing to give that for the class conversation and discussion and debates, right? But it can also go much quicker if that's something that you're wanting. Have them discuss it with a partner really quick and have them turn it into you. You can look them over that night and come back the next day and say, hey, here are ones that everyone put, or do a hand raise, right, of how many of you have this event. And, you know, you would hope that most students would have something about the Gulf War, right? I am the Gulf War, okay? And then you would have all of those pieces that would be included on there. Now, you can also extend it and really, really challenge the students and say, okay, I want you to take 2 of the events from the very middle of your timeline, and I want you to create a new 6 degree of separation where you're really having them hone in and narrow their focus to a particular time period. So this is great when you start with the really broad 6 degree of separation where you're doing, you know, a quarter or a semester or class ending one, and then have them hone in on different events. And you can go around the room and say, okay, I want you guys to focus in on these 2, and have them all then create like a sub one for some of the smaller units of study. Or you could also ask students to try to replace the first or last event with something new that would completely transform it and make it impossible for their 6 degree of separation to stay the same, and then challenge their partner with it. Right? So if instead of 9/11, if I were to pick something like the Oklahoma City bombings, right? And then all of a sudden, okay, now how does your timeline change? And what events would have to go in place? And the students really have fun with that one because they try to one-up their peers and try and say, can I stump you and can I make mine better than yours is? So that's a really fun one when you're starting with a broad 6 degree of separation. Now, if we take a look at a more narrow 6 degree of separation, this can be done in a number of ways, right? You could do it thematically, you could do it for units, you could do it on a single chapter within a book or section within a book. You can really do the narrow focus again in whatever way. I chose to go more topical with a Native American focus, so starting with the first Thanksgiving and ending with the Trail of Tears. So again, what I would encourage you to do is to pause the video and take the time to fill this in for yourself. If you had to pick 4 events connecting the first Thanksgiving to the Trail of Tears, what 4 events would you pick? And why those 4 events? Now, comparing the experience that you had with both the broad and the narrow 6 degrees of separation, think of how that experience differs. Which one is easier to come up with and which one is more difficult to come up with, right? And a lot of times you find way more than 4 events that you want to be able to put into your timeline or into your chronology and your 6 degrees of separation. And it's so frustrating to not be able to put more of them in there. And so having them really have to analyze that causation and which one is more important than the others. And between the broad and narrow concentration, you'll find that the conversations differ most definitely as well. And there are pros and cons to each, but really when it comes down to implementation and how you can use it, I've seen, heard, and experienced so many different ways that this very simple teaching technique can be used to really, really broaden students' investigation of history, understanding of history, and being able to have them connect content from prior units to what they're studying now.